The wind howled through the snow-laden pines, carrying with it the deep guttural roar of a grizzly bear. The sound reverberated through the frozen expanse, startling birds into the brittle air and sending echoes ricocheting off distant peaks. Standing on the banks of a glacial river, a mother bear, her fur dusted with frost, bellowed once more, her massive paws clawing at the icy edge. Her breath puffed into the frigid air in desperate rhythmic bursts, each exhale a testament to her anguish. The river was treacherous, a thick sheet of ice fractured and jagged along its surface, betraying the fierce current beneath. Under the dim light of a cloud-covered sun, the scene shimmered with a deceptive beauty, the river a ribbon of silver laced with menace. Yet beauty was far from the mind of this mother bear. Her powerful frame, usually so sure and steady, trembled as she paced. Her small brown cubs had ventured ahead, curious and carefree, their playful steps betraying their naivety of the world's dangers. Now they were nowhere to be seen. The icy river seemed to swallow the sound of their calls, and the silence felt like a heavy weight. Her eyes, sharp and wild, darted along the banks and across the frozen expanse. Then she heard it, a faint, muffled cry. Her head whipped to the side, ears swiveling to locate the sound. There, far out on the broken ice movement, a small figure struggling against the merciless grip of the river's edge was barely visible. The cub's cries rose in urgency, a high-pitched plea that pierced the air and drove the mother bear into action. She let out a roar that seemed to shatter the stillness, plunging into the unknown to face whatever lay ahead. The wilderness of Montana was both breathtaking and unforgiving. Towering evergreens lined the snow-blanketed landscape, their branches bending beneath the weight of ice. The river, a lifeline for the creatures of this land, had transformed into a deceptive labyrinth of brittle ice and turbulent waters beneath. Winter ruled here, indifferent to the struggles of those who called this place home. Among these hardy inhabitants was the mother bear, a survivor of many harsh seasons. She had raised her cubs with unwavering vigilance, teaching them how to navigate this ruthless environment. But even her instincts could not predict every danger. Her cubs, drawn to the shimmering surface of the frozen river, had seen it as a playground, not the peril it was. The cubs were barely out of their first year, their fur still plush with the softness of youth. They tumbled over one another, pawing at the ice with an innocence that betrayed their vulnerability. Their mother had watched from a distance, her massive form blending with the shadows of the forest, always on alert. But when the ice beneath their tiny paws cracked and gave way, even her sharp reflexes were no match for nature's sudden cruelty. The river claimed the cubs in an instant. The icy sheet splintered, plunging them into the frigid water below. Their cries, sharp and panicked, carried over the rushing current as they struggled to keep their heads above water. The mother bear charged toward the sound, her powerful frame crashing through snowdrifts as she reached the riverbank. She roared again, a primal cry that echoed through the stillness. Her eyes locked onto the broken ice, scanning for signs of her young. A flash of movement caught her gaze, one of the cubs clinging to a jagged shard of ice that bobbed precariously in the current. The other had already been swept downstream, its small head barely visible amidst the churn of water and slush. This was no ordinary winter's challenge. The ice was unstable, the current unrelenting. Even for a creature as formidable as the grizzly, the risk was great. But a mother's love is a force that defies reason, and the bear, with one last glance at the turbulent river, steeled herself for what she had to do. As the wind bit at her exposed fur and the icy water lapped at her claws, the wilderness seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether she could defy its brutal grasp. The first plunge stole her breath. The icy water gripped her body like a vice, piercing through her thick fur and sinking into her flesh. The current roared beneath the fractured ice, an unyielding force that seemed determined to pull her under. But the mother bear, driven by an instinct more potent than fear, pressed on. Her powerful limbs churned against the freezing torrent. As she pushed toward the struggling cub, the first cub clung desperately to a shard of ice, its small claws slipping against the slick surface. Its cries were muffled by the wind and water, but they cut through the mother's heart, with a clarity that only a parent could feel. She lunged forward, her great paw breaking through the thin sheet of ice as she grabbed hold of the cub's scruff with her jaws. For a moment she was still, The weight of the cub and the ferocity of the current testing even her immense strength. Her muscles burned as she hauled the cub onto a floating patch of ice. It lay there, shivering, its small body trembling against the cold. But its cries softened as it felt the warmth of its mother's touch. She nudged the cub toward the shore, but there was no time to rest. A shrill whimper from farther downstream jolted her attention back to the river. The second cub was slipping farther away, its head dipping beneath the water before bobbing back up again. Panic flared in the mother's chest as she realized the current was stronger there, the ice more fragmented. Without hesitation, she dove again, her massive body cutting through the icy water like a dark shadow. The current fought her with every stroke, dragging her downstream and forcing her under the ice. For a terrifying moment she disappeared from view, the turbulent river swallowing her whole. The cub, still struggling in the icy water, let out another wail as it was pulled farther away. Then, with a sudden burst of power, the mother bear emerged, gasping for air, her fur clinging to her muscular frame as she clawed her way toward the cub. Her eyes, fierce and determined, never wavered from her goal. Finally, she reached the cub. Her jaws found purchase, and she lifted it clear of the water. The cub dangled limply for a moment, its small chest heaving as it struggled to breathe. With a surge of strength, she powered through the current, dragging herself and her precious burden back toward the nearest patch of solid ice. The river fought her every step of the way. The ice cracked and shifted beneath her weight, the water threatening to reclaim her at every turn. But she refused to yield. As her claws found purchase on the riverbank, she hoisted herself and her cub to safety. Exhausted, she collapsed onto the snow, her breath coming in labored gasps. Both cubs huddled close to her, their small bodies pressed against hers as she wrapped them in the warmth of her embrace. The danger was far from over, but for now they were together. Above them, the sky darkened, the sun sinking behind the jagged peaks. The wilderness seemed to sigh in relief, as if acknowledging the triumph of this mother's love against the merciless river. The momentary relief of reaching the riverbank was fleeting. The mother bear, drenched and shivering, lay with her cubs pressed close to her chest. Their small bodies trembled not just from the cold, but from the shock of their ordeal. The icy wind swept across the landscape, stinging her soaked fur and biting at her exposed skin. But she ignored the discomfort. Her eyes were locked on the river, still churning with menace as if daring her to falter. But she knew their ordeal wasn't over. The cubs, weak from the freezing waters, needed warmth and safety. They whimpered softly, their cries pulling at her heart. She nudged them gently, urging them to move, but they could barely lift their heads. The snow, though soft beneath her paws, offered no refuge. The cubs wouldn't survive long in the open. The mother bear's gaze darted around their surroundings. The dense forest offered potential shelter, but the journey would be perilous with the cubs in their current state. She let out a low growl, more a sound of frustration than threat, and rose to her feet. Her body ached, her muscles stiff from the icy river, but she couldn't afford to stop now. As she surveyed the river once more, her sharp eyes caught movement upstream. A large chunk of ice had lodged itself against a boulder, creating a temporary barrier in the current. The ice, thick and sturdy, could be a bridge to a safer side of the riverbank, where the trees grew closer together, promising a shield against the relentless wind. She glanced down at her cubs, their small forms huddled together. If she could get them there, they might stand a chance. With a gentle nudge, she coaxed the stronger of the two cubs to its feet. The little one wobbled, but managed to take a few unsteady steps, guided by its mother's support. The second cub, weaker and less responsive, needed more care. The mother bear gripped it by the scruff of its neck, lifting it with her powerful jaws. With the other cub trailing close, she began the trek toward the makeshift bridge. Each step was treacherous. The snow concealed hidden dangers, rocks, patches of ice, and uneven ground that could easily trip her. The cubs stumbled often, their tiny legs barely able to carry them. She stopped frequently to nudge and encourage them forward, her patience unwavering. The icy wind cut through the air, howling through the trees like a warning, but she pressed on. As they approached the ice bridge, the mother bear paused. She tested the surface with one massive paw, pressing down to gauge its strength. It creaked ominously, but held. With deliberate caution, she stepped onto the ice, her claws digging in for balance. The cub following behind hesitated, letting out a frightened whimper. The mother turned, her eyes meeting the cub's, and let out a soft, reassuring rumble. It was enough. The cub took a tentative step, then another, until it was safely on the ice beside her. The crossing was agonizingly slow. Every shift of weight caused the ice to groan under their combined mass, sending ripples of unease through the air. Beneath them, the river raged, its icy fingers reaching for them through cracks in the surface. The mother bear's muscles tensed with every step, her body a shield between the river and her young. She carried the weaker cub with care, its small body swinging gently in her jaws as she moved. When they finally reached the far side of the river, she let out a low grunt of relief. The cubs collapsed onto the snow, too weak to move further. But they were alive, and for the moment safe. The mother bear stood over them, her body trembling from exhaustion but her spirit unyielding. The forest loomed ahead, dark and inviting. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, a place to regroup and regain their strength. She nudged the cubs once more, encouraging them toward the trees. Their journey was far from over, but they had survived the worst of the river's wrath. As they disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the wind seemed to die down, as if nature itself had granted them a brief reprieve. The forest canopy offered some respite from the relentless wind, its thick branches catching the falling snow before it could settle on the mother bear and her cubs. But the danger was not over. Though they had escaped the river, the cubs were weak, their small bodies shivering uncontrollably. The mother bear moved with urgency, searching for a sheltered spot where she could warm them, her keen nose working through the biting air. As she pressed deeper into the woods, the sound of voices stopped her in her tracks. Humans. She froze, her body low to the ground, her ears twitching as she tried to determine the direction of the noise. It was faint but unmistakable, carried by the wind from somewhere nearby. The voices belonged to a group of tourists who had been hiking through the area, their bright jackets stark against the muted tones of the winter landscape. They had heard the commotion from the river, the bear's roars, the cubs' cries, and the sharp cracks of ice breaking. Now, curious and concerned, they followed the sound, unaware of how close they were to the mother bear's path. From her vantage point, behind a snow-covered thicket, the mother bear watched. Her heart raced, not from fear for herself but for her cubs. Humans were unpredictable. Some posed no threat, while others could mean harm. She let out a low growl, a warning for the strangers to keep their distance, but the sound was lost in the wind. One of the hikers, a young woman with a pair of binoculars slung around her neck, stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice hushed. The group fell silent, straining to hear over the rustling trees. Another voice spoke up. "It sounds like a bear. Maybe close." The young woman raised her binoculars, scanning the forest. Her eyes caught movement, a patch of dark fur shifting among the trees. She gasped softly. "Over there. I think it's a mother bear. And her cubs." One of the hikers hesitated. "Should we turn back? We don't want to get too close," but the woman shook her head. "Something's wrong. Look at how she's moving. She looks distressed. The cubs, too. They might be in trouble." The group deliberated for a moment, torn between caution and concern. Eventually, they decided to call for help. One of them dialed the number for the local park ranger station, describing the situation and their location as best as they could. It wasn't long before a ranger arrived, his truck crunching over the snow-covered trail. He was a seasoned professional, his calm demeanor reassuring as he approached the group. The hikers led him to the spot where they had seen the bear, pointing out the direction she had gone. The ranger nodded, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the area. A mother bear with cubs in winter. She'll be defensive. But if the cubs are in trouble, we need to help. He moved carefully, his years of experience guiding his steps as he followed the faint tracks left in the snow. The mother bear heard him before she saw him, her ears flattened, her body bristling as she placed herself between her cubs and the approaching human. She let out a warning roar, low and guttural, her eyes fixed on the figure in the distance. The ranger stopped immediately, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice calm and steady. He took a slow step back, giving the bear space. He could see the cubs now, huddled at her feet, their small bodies trembling. They were alive, but barely. The ranger assessed the situation carefully. He knew that direct intervention could escalate the bear's distress, but leaving the cubs in their current state wasn't an option. Slowly, he knelt, pulling a thermal blanket from his pack. He spread it out on the snow and took another step, back hoping to communicate his intent. The mother bear eyed him warily, her body tense. She didn't trust this human, but something in his movements, calm, deliberate, non-threatening, kept her from charging. She sniffed the air, catching the faint scent of the ranger and the hikers who lingered nearby. Minutes passed, each one heavy with tension. The ranger stayed where he was, waiting for the bear to decide. Finally, as if understanding that this human meant no harm, the mother bear relaxed slightly. She nudged her cubs closer to her chest, her eyes never leaving the ranger as she settled into the snow. The ranger remained at a distance, his presence a silent reassurance. He couldn't do much more without risking the fragile trust that had formed, but for now his careful intervention had given the mother bear and her cubs a chance. Above them, the sky began to clear, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the forest. It was a rare moment of peace, a fragile harmony between human and wildlife that spoke to something deeper, an unspoken connection, born of compassion and respect. The ranger's heart pounded as he held his position, careful not to make any sudden movements. The mother bear remained vigilant, her large frame shielding her cubs from the human figure before her. Yet, there was no aggression in her stance, only a watchful caution, as though she were weighing the intentions of this stranger. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the only sound the occasional whistle of the wind through the trees. The ranger knew that time was against them. The cubs were visibly weakening. Their tiny bodies trembled as they huddled against their mother, their breath shallow and erratic. The frigid ordeal they had endured was taking its toll, and unless something was done soon, they wouldn't survive the night. He spoke softly, his voice barely louder than the whispering wind. "I'm here to help you, girl," he murmured. His words meant more for himself than the bear. He carefully reached for his radio, his eyes never leaving her. "This is Ranger Callahan. I've located the bear and her cubs. They're alive, but in bad shape. I'll need thermal covers and a portable heating unit brought to my location. Over." The crackle of the radio startled the mother bear momentarily, and she let out a low growl, but the ranger remained still, keeping his movements deliberate and measured. The response came quickly, confirming that additional supplies were en route. The ranger then slowly unfolded a thermal blanket from his pack, laying it gently on the ground a safe distance from the bear. He backed away again, lowering himself to a crouch to appear as unthreatening as possible. The mother bear sniffed the air, her sharp senses catching the unfamiliar but harmless scent of the material. She hesitated, her instincts warring with her need to protect her cubs. Finally, with a tentative step, she moved forward. Her massive paw reached out to touch the edge of the blanket, her claws brushing the fabric. Then, as if deciding it posed no threat, she returned to her cubs and, with a nudge, encouraged them toward the warmth. The cubs, too weak to resist, allowed themselves to be guided onto the blanket. Their tiny bodies sagged into the insulated surface, their shivers easing slightly as they felt its warmth. The ranger exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. He continued to keep his distance, respecting the fragile trust the bear had shown him. Soon the sound of another engine approached, and he signaled the additional team to stop a safe distance away. A second ranger emerged, carrying a heating unit and additional supplies. Together, they devised a careful plan. They couldn't risk sedating the bear, as the cubs needed her warmth and presence to survive. Instead, they worked methodically, creating a perimeter of warmth and safety that the mother bear could control. The second ranger set the unit down and backed away, leaving the equipment in plain sight. The mother bear watched every movement, her eyes sharp and calculating. Once again, she allowed her curiosity to guide her. She approached the equipment cautiously, sniffing it before nudging it with her nose. Satisfied it posed no danger, she returned to her cubs, curling her body around them as the warmth began to seep into their small forms. The sight was both humbling and heartwarming. The two rangers stood in silence, their admiration for the bear evident in their expressions. Even in her exhaustion, the mother bear's instincts never faltered. She adjusted her position, ensuring the cubs were shielded from the wind, her every movement a testament to her unyielding love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a dusky glow, the rangers began their retreat. Their intervention had been minimal, just enough to provide the bear and her cubs a fighting chance. They knew the mother would take care of the rest, her strength and determination far surpassing anything they could offer. From a distance, they watched as she stood, her cubs now stirring weakly at her side. She nudged them toward the forest, leading them away from the humans and deeper into the safety of the trees. The rangers didn't follow, understanding that their part in this story had come to an end. As the mother bear disappeared into the shadows, the forest seemed to exhale. The crisis was over, and though the night was still cold and the path ahead uncertain, the bond between mother and cubs had endured, stronger than the river's icy grip and fiercer than the winter's chill. The forest fell silent as the mother bear and her cubs vanished into the shadows, their fragile figures swallowed by the protective embrace of the trees. The rangers stood motionless for a moment, their breath visible in the crisp evening air. Though their intervention had been subtle, the emotional weight of what they had witnessed hung heavy. It wasn't just a rescue. They had been part of something far more profound. Ranger Callahan knelt, his gloved hand brushing the snow where the mother bear had stood moments before. "It's incredible, isn't it?" he said softly to his colleague. "The length she went to, the fight she gave for them." The other ranger nodded, her eyes still fixed on the forest. "It's humbling." She didn't hesitate, not for a second, and those cubs, they're lucky to have her. Their words faded into the quiet as they gathered their supplies. Though the scene had passed, its impact lingered. It was a testament to the raw, unfiltered beauty of nature, a mother's love transcending the boundaries of species, an act of courage that resonated deeply with the humans who bore witness to it. Later, as they drove back to the ranger station, Callahan reflected on the fragility and resilience of life in the wilderness. The bear's struggle against the icy river was a stark reminder of how unforgiving nature could be, yet her triumph spoke to the extraordinary strength found within even the most vulnerable creatures. "We always talk about protecting wildlife," Callahan said as they reached the station, his voice heavy with thought. "But seeing something like this, well, it makes you realize we're not just protecting animals, we're preserving these moments, these connections that remind us of what's truly important." Back in the warmth of the station, he documented the event, his words infused with the emotion of what he had experienced. He emphasized the delicate balance of the ecosystem, the need for conservation efforts to ensure creatures like the mother bear and her cubs had a fighting chance in a world that seemed increasingly encroaching. Far from the station, in the heart of the forest, the mother bear and her cubs had found temporary shelter beneath a thicket of fir trees. The cubs, now slightly stronger, nestled against their mother's warm body. She licked their damp fur, her low, rhythmic grunts soothing them into a state of calm. Above them, the sky had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars. The world around them was harsh and unyielding, but for the moment they were safe. The cubs drifted into sleep, their tiny chests rising and falling in unison. The mother bear remained alert, her eyes scanning the dark forest, her ears twitching at every sound. She had done what she could. The rest was up to fate and the resilience of her young. The ranger's efforts had been a brief intersection in her life, a fleeting moment of shared space and mutual respect. But their actions, like hers, were driven by a deep-seated need to protect, to nurture, and to ensure survival against the odds.